Waxman, let me stop you there because you referred to the personal score. And that's a score that Harvard gives based on character traits such as integrity, courage, kindness, and empathy. But the record shows that Asian student applicants get the lowest personal scores of any other group. What accounts for that? It has to be one of two things. It has to be that they really do lack integrity, courage, kindness, and empathy to the same degree as students of other races, or there has to be something wrong with his personal score.
That is, I mean, I want to get to what the evidence was there, but that syllogism, with all due respect, is wrong. There was, for example, a study that was done in 1983 that looked at why it was that female applicants to graduate school at the University of...
No, just address this. The personal score that's given to Asian applicants to Harvard, why are they given a lower score than any other group?
Okay, so the answer to why they, as a group, why there is a slight numerical disparity with respect to the personal rating of Asian Americans, and also a slight numerical disparity to the advantage of Asian Americans with respect to the extracurricular rating and the academic rating, was the answer that their expert gave with respect to the latter two, which is that the only way that the only model that can be created to figure out what was going into the personal rating couldn't look at almost anything that admissions officers look at in those ratings. It can't, there's no way that it could model what the guidance counselor letters said, what the teacher letters said, what the essays said, what the interviewers' letters said. In other words,
I thought the interviewers did not rate the applicants lower than other applicants based on race. There was not the disparity in what was done by what was said by the interviewers.
With respect to the alumni interviewers, based on the subset that was included here, their subset, by the way, excluded all ALDC applicants. That is, even though they acknowledged that there was not only no evidence of discrimination against Asian American ALDCs, but they did better. They eliminated from their model applicants that represent, on average, 30% of the admitted class.
I still, putting aside the teacher recommendations or guidance counselor recommendations, which I'll come to, I still haven't heard any explanation for the disparity between the personal scores that are given to Asians. They rank below whites, they rank way below Hispanics, and really way below African Americans. And you're talking about hundreds and hundreds of applicants, maybe thousands. What is the explanation for that?
So the explanation that was, I can't do better than the findings of fact in the trial court as affirmed, but I want to make 2 points very clear with respect to your question. All of this evidence was, all of this was on display and in front of the trial court for this Asian American part of it for well more than a week, maybe 2 weeks. The district court found, considering all of the evidence, that there is, quote, no credible evidence that corroborates the improper discrimination suggested by SFFA's interpretation of the personal rating, page 264.
Well, all right, I'll try one more time. The district court found, quote, a statistically significant and negative relationship between Asian American identity and the personal rating assigned by Harvard admissions officers.
That's correct. And what she said is the record will not allow a full explanation of that because there was no evidence with respect to what teachers said, what guidance counselors said, what these students wrote about. But what we can say with respect to the allegation of discrimination in this case, which was the definition of discrimination that was at issue in Bakke and Grutter and Fisher, and which their lawyer got up at opening statement and said, when we talk about discrimination, in this case, we're talking about discrimination in admissions outcomes. And here again, the district court found, and the Court of Appeals also concluded, that there was no evidence of discrimination in admissions outcomes against Asian Americans, whatever you think about the personal rating, which is, after all, simply a number
Justice Alito would like to ask a question.
I'm sorry, I'm not trying to filibuster you.
Finish your sentence, then
Okay.
I will ask one more question.
I want to make one other thing clear to the extent that it's not clear from the record. The personal rating, like the academic rating and the extracurricular rating and the athletic rating, is a number that is put down by a, quote, first reader. That is, the file comes in, it's not usually complete, and just as a matter of triage, one of the 40 admissions officers goes through and gives these numerical numbers. The testimony was, it is not considered in any way once the subcommittees and committees meet. It, quote, fades into the background. It is not the basis of admissions decisions. And so not only did the court find as fact that that slight disparity was not evidence of discrimination, even in the personal rating, it had no effect with respect to outcomes.
It makes no difference whatsoever?
It's not that it makes no difference whatsoever. Look at what the expert testimony was, and I realize
Does it make a difference or doesn't it make a difference?
It doesn't make a statistical difference in admissions outcomes,
then why do you
as
do
both
it?
courts
Then
found.
why do you do it?
It
doesn't matter. Why do you do it?
We do it as a matter of triage. Right now, Harvard is last year got 61,000 applications for 1,600 slots. And it is an entirely rational way of figuring out how you were going to allocate your attention to ask an admissions officer, as the file is being developed, just go through in a very rough way and rate a particular application based on what you can see on these 4 metrics. The fact that Asian Americans got on average, a marginally lower personal rating score is no more evidence of discrimination against them than the fact that they got a marginally higher rating than any data can show on academics and extracurriculars. It doesn't mean that they're either smarter or people think they're smarter.
Thank you, counsel.
Let me just ask one more related question, and that is the circumstance. This is a real problem, and I've heard it described to me by people who face it. When can a student honestly claim to fall within one of these groups that is awarded a plus factor? So let's say the student has one grandparent who falls within that class. Can the student claim to be a member of an underrepresented minority?
Yes, we rely on self-reporting, and we don't give it.
One great-grandparent.
If that person believes that that is the accurate expression of their identity, I don't think there would be any.
One great-great-grandparent.
You're
going to make me continue to go on.
Right. I think that as we go on, I agree that it would seem less plausible that that person would feel that this is actually capturing my true racial identity. But the same is true for any of the other diversity factors that we
It's family lore that we have an ancestor who was an American Indian.
So I think in that particular circumstance, it would be not accurate for them to say, based on
I identify as an American Indian because I've always been told that some ancestor back in the old days was an American Indian.
Yeah, so I think in that circumstance, it would be very unlikely that that person was telling the truth. And the same is true for, we rely on self-reporting for all the demographic and other characteristics that we ask for. And there's nothing special about the racial identification on that score, Your Honor.
Justice Alito?
I'd like your response to the argument that these racial categories are so broad that any use of them is arbitrary and therefore unconstitutional. So what would you say to, for example, a student whose family came from Afghanistan and doesn't get in because the student doesn't get the plus factor that the student would get if the student's family had come from someplace else? So you would say to the student, well, we don't need you to contribute to a diversity of views at our school because we already have enough Asians. We have a lot of students whose families came from China or other Asian countries. And the student says, well, you don't have anybody like me. I'm from Afghanistan. What similarity does a family background of a person from Afghanistan have with somebody whose family's background is in, let's say, Japan?
So respectfully, what you're describing is the exact opposite of how our process actually works on an individualized basis. We discussed this on page 11 of our brief. There was a Vietnamese student, the admissions officer testified about a Vietnamese student who immigrated to a remote part of North Carolina and thrived in that setting. And she testified undisputed that was a favorable aspect of her application.
That's an individual aspect of the application and something that has to do with her experience. But what is the justification for lumping together students whose families came from China with students whose families came from Afghanistan? What do they have in common?
So I agree that would be a strange rule, and that is not the rule that this court has established.
Well, then why do you have them check a box that I'm Asian? What do you learn from the mere checking of the box?
So we think that it depends on the individual circumstances of that person. But
so you don't need the boxes at all.
So I think that is not necessarily true on an individualized basis. So another example. So we, again, as I discussed, we attempt very vigorously to recruit and enroll rural students. And we don't ask them to write their essay about how being from a rural background affects their sense of self and their experiences. But what we say is that person comes with something that we value.
Well, they may choose to write about it. But what's the answer to my question? Why do you have these boxes? Why do you give a student the opportunity to say, this one thing about me, I'm Hispanic, I'm African American, I'm Asian. What does that in itself tell you?
We think that it can, in context, on a individualized basis, perhaps not in every case, but in some cases, give important information about where that person is coming from and what their experiences have been. And really, this goes to the heart of the dispute that we have between the parties. So they say on page 53 of their brief that race says nothing about who you are. And we just don't think that is true when you look at American society as it exists. We think that in the context of everything else that we know about an applicant, it can matter, not always, and there's no automatic plus factor that's given, but it can matter what an applicant's racial background is.
Let me just ask one more related question, and that is, the circumstance, this is a real problem, and I've heard it described to me by people who face it. When can a student honestly claim to fall within one of these groups that is awarded a plus factor? So let's say the student has one grandparent who falls within that class. Can the student claim to be a member of an underrepresented minority?
Yes, we rely on self-reporting, and we don't give it.
One great-grandparent.
If that person believes that that is the accurate expression of their identity, I don't think there would be any.
One great-great-grandparent. You're going to make me continue to go on.
Right. I think that as we go on, I agree that it would seem less plausible that that person would feel that this is actually capturing my true racial identity. But the same is true for any of the other diversity factors that we.
It's family lore that we have an ancestor who was an American Indian.
So I think in that particular circumstance, it would be not accurate for them to say based on.
I identify as an American Indian because I've always been told that some ancestor back in the old days was an American Indian.
Yeah, so I think in that circumstance, it would be very unlikely that that person was telling the truth. And the same is true for, we rely on self-reporting for all the demographic and other characteristics that we ask for. And there's nothing special about the racial identification on that score, Your Honor.
Justice Alito?
You make some very good points in your brief, but reading it, I was struck by the fact that the word Asian does not appear one time in your brief. Yet Asian Americans have been subjected to de jure segregation, They have been subjected to many forms of mistreatment and discrimination, including internment. So do you have anything to say this morning about the interests of students of Asian background and how your arguments impact them?
Yes, Your Honor. So 2 points. One is that discrimination against Asian Americans is wrong. It's bad. We do not condone it at all. But 2, our brief actually reflects the record in this case. There were no claims developed by petitioner involving the mistreatment or maltreatment of Asian American students. And I think that was one of the problems that happened with the first brief is that they conflated their arguments against Harvard, which Mr. Waxman will adequately defend shortly. But those arguments conflated the issues. There's no racial balancing claim against UNC. There's no allegation of quota. There's been a lot of talk about quota in this case. There's no claim about that. There's no claim against UNC involving the intentional discrimination against Asian American students vis-a-vis white students or other students. So that record actually doesn't exist.
So what is your response to the simple argument that college admissions are a zero-sum game? And if you give a plus to a person who is falls within the category of underrepresented minority, but not to somebody else, you are disadvantaging the latter student.
And Your Honor, that's an excellent point, but the record actually bears out about how, in this case, how the holistic admissions plans does end up operating. And it is where an individualized consideration is being made on a student's own talents, on a student's own achievements.
So you're saying that race in and of itself has no effect at the University of North Carolina?
Absolutely not, Your Honor.
Okay, then you would have no objection to an opinion from this court saying you may not consider race. You may consider other things, but you may not consider the mere fact of race, period. You would have no objection to that.
Your Honor, I don't know if I'm answering your question with a negative and a double negative here, but I do want to make clear that we fully support the limited consideration of race as it has been authorized by this court.
Well,
again,
then
it is
I just
only
don't,
on an individual.
I don't understand your answer. Either if it's irrelevant, then you shouldn't care whether it's ruled out.
And we're not, if I'm articulating that, Your Honor, I'm not meaning to. We certainly believe that race within the context of an applicant may be considered as a plus factor. That's not
Race in
only
itself may be considered a plus factor.
Yes, Your Honor.
And therefore, those who don't get the plus factor have what is essentially a negative factor.
No, Your Honor.
It's not the same thing?
No, Your Honor, it's not, because it's looking at the whole applicant as they apply within their whole application and their resume, et cetera.
Suppose you have a race, two people are in a race, and you give a plus factor to one of the runners. So that runner gets to start. Well, if it's a 100-yard dash, let's say it gets to start 5 yards closer to the finish line. The one who doesn't get that plus factor is disadvantaged, right?
That would be in that case, but that case is not here. There are no bonus points that are provided to any applicant at the University of North Carolina. That is fully prohibited by this court's decision in Gratz, and we're not suggesting that it should be reinstituted.